so we're going to jump right into it. And from feedback from previous sessions, I'm also going to try something new, which is to not only work within the more static dynamic of a PowerPoint presentation, but also jump out of it and show you some web links and how to use some of these tools specifically so you can see them as they're working. Hopefully that will work. And let me start with sharing my screen and hope that technology remains kind to us. Great. I'm just going to ask for confirmation that you can see the cover slide of the PowerPoint, which says Vermont Wetlands Program. Can anybody tell me yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So hi, everyone. Zapata Courage. I am with the State of Vermont Wetlands Program. I'm one of the district wetland ecologists. I cover Addison and Rutland counties primarily in a regulatory capacity. So I do desktop reviews all of the time. And it has become more important that as projects are commencing or being planned for, that the resources on site are identified so that appropriate timing can occur, or permitting that might need to be secured for a permit to move forward, or the project to move forward. So this is a very basic introduction to aerial interpretation through desktop review for potential wetland presence. And with all the tools that we now have at our disposal, there's actually quite a bit we can do from our desk. But to start with, I want to make sure everybody is on the same page as to what the definition of a wetland is, specifically in Vermont, as it does change throughout the country and even within our neighboring states. So in Vermont, these are the areas that are inundated by surface or groundwater with a frequency sufficient to support vegetation or aquatic life. Basically, if an area is wet for approximately 2 weeks out of the growing season, it's highly likely to form the conditions for wetland identification. If we're working in and around lakes, then wetland jurisdiction can extend out to a depth of approximately 6.5 feet if that area is dominated by emergent or woody vegetation. So think lily pads. So to begin with, what makes up a wetland? And a wetland is defined by 3 parameters. First, you have to have a source of water, and that can even be seen during the winter. Welcome back to winter. For water, that can be surface water, but that can also be things like a high groundwater table, something that might not easily be seen right off. When you have water in an area long enough, it pushes the oxygen out of your soils, and in turn, it forms what are called hydric soils or wetland soils. And we'll be getting into each one of these further into the PowerPoint. So when you have water, it is there long enough to form your soils. That in turn will dictate the type of vegetation that's going to grow. Your hydrophytic vegetation or water-loving vegetation is a misnomer. They actually don't love water. It's that they've developed adaptations or tolerance to a low oxygen environment due to the presence of water. So a kind of a different way of looking at it. And cattails are iconic for that, but we're going to get into cattails also. So what is wetland hydrology? So back to the definition, it's the inundation or saturation of the soil for at least 5% of the growing season in most years. And that's approximately 2 weeks. Now, wetlands are often associated with streams or lakes because the hydrology is already present in the form of our surface waters. Primary examples of hydrology includes our surface waters, high groundwater tables, or things like inundation visible on aerial imagery. I call that one out because that's often something we can see during a desktop review. There are also secondary indicators. So if you go to a site visit and you see water-stained leaves or stunted or stressed plants, and also ask yourself, where do you expect water to move or concentrate on the landscape? So your geomorphic position, what are your drainage patterns? And some of these you can also see through a desktop review. So when you have water and it's there long enough, it forms your hydric soils. Um, Depending on the makeup of your soils, it will dictate typically the type of colors it's going to change. Your hydric mineral soils tend to become very gray with the orange or red mottling. So think of like rust. Whereas your organic soils tend to become very dark, almost black. Think of your mucks. Um, the best way I can describe hydric soils is that they fall in the cool brown colors. So gray brown, green brown, black brown, blue brown, gray brown. Whereas your upland soils tend to be your warm colors. So that's where your red, orange, yellow, and I'll say teddy bear brown comes into play. Once you have your water plus your soils, then the plants will come. And the vegetation, like I mentioned, are adapted to low oxygenated environments, and consequently, they vary in their tolerance of wetland conditions. So you have a gradation of your wetland plants. Your cattails, which typically always want their roots wet. 99% of the time, if you see cattails, it's likely to be a wetland, unless it's a man-made, infrastructure like stormwater. Whereas in other cases, like our sensitive fern here, which is the cartoon fern down below, 33 to 66% of the time, if you see these guys, then you would probably have a wetland. And even in the winter, this is why I included this specific photo, you might be able to tell whether some of these plants are present. Once you have a dominance of these water-loving or low oxygenated plants, that's when, in the combination of water and soils, you have a wetland at that location. So in Vermont, why does this matter? It's because the state of Vermont has jurisdiction over most of the wetlands in the state. So they are regulated by and under the Vermont wetland rules. And it's those wetlands that are deemed significant enough to be protected based on their functions and values. So our jurisdictional wetlands. Any wetland that is on our VSWI map, I'll get into that. Any wetland that is contiguous or connected to those mapped wetlands, or any wetland that is the same type or size as what is currently on those maps. And typically that is those wetlands that are half acre or larger. So this is an example of the VSWI map, and I'll be showing you how to access it a little later. But there's a lot of different colors. We'll talk about that as well. But the teal colors are the ones that are mapped, and the I'm going to say lime green color are the ones that are connected to those mapped wetlands. And so all of those would be considered jurisdictional. Jurisdictional wetlands also include those that are adjacent to our surface waters, streams, lakes, ponds, rivers, where its size is approximately 2,500 square feet. So we're looking as size of a wetland increases, so does its equivalent functions and values, and that's what we're trying to protect along our surface waters. Headwater wetlands above 2,500 feet in elevation, they typically are the start of a lot of our surface waters. Vernal pools because of their amphibian breeding, and then our special and unique wetlands like bogs or fens. The caveat to this is, remember, between 39 to 46% of Vermont wetlands maps have historically not been mapped, but they are jurisdictional. And I'll talk about historically not mapped because we've got some exciting things happening within the wetland program where we hope to reduce this number. So a lot of people think about wetlands and immediately it comes to cattails. If you'll notice, none of these photos actually have cattails in it, but they're all wetlands. And that's because Vermont is lucky enough to have a number of wetland types. And these include our forested swamps, our scrub shrub wetlands, so willow and alder, our emergent marshes, which yes, can include our cattail marshes, bogs and fens, our seeps. So there's certain areas of the state that are notorious for their seeps. Killington is a great example of that. Vernal pools, which you can see in our bottom right-hand corner. So those seasonal depressional features, and our wet meadows. So think of a lot of our marginal agricultural hayfields. So back to our functions and values. These are the 10 functions and values that the state has identified as being worthy of protection when the wetland is providing it at a significant level. What you'll not notice here is that there isn't anything mentioned about carbon sequestration or climate change. And I think that is still part of the overarching dialogue. Also in Vermont, we're unique in the fact that we have a classification system for our wetlands. And those classifications are based on an evaluation of those functions and values. And in the case of our class 1 wetlands, that they have been petitioned as such, either internally or by a third party, to be reclassified as those exemplary or irreplaceable wetlands, which is class 1s, and consequently, they receive the highest level of protection with a default minimum 100-foot buffer, but that buffer could increase. So Peach and Bog, for example, has a 500-foot buffer around it. Most of the wetlands in Vermont are class 2 wetlands. So going back to those jurisdictional wetlands in the previous slide, they are protected with a jurisdictional 50-foot buffer. And that's important from a standpoint of project design and location, siting and project design. For those wetlands that are typically isolated, not connected to our surface waters, or smaller than a half acre, not mapped, then they could be determined as class 3 wetlands, which currently under Vermont wetland rules, they are not regulated. So I mentioned a buffer zone, and this gives you a visual depiction of what that buffer zone would be, the upland area adjacent to our wetland. And our class 2 wetlands have a 50-foot default regulated buffer zone. Our class 1 wetlands have a 100-foot buffer zone, although that buffer could be increased as part of the petition and rulemaking. And correspondingly, as the buffer continues to increase, so does additional functions and values on the landscape, and also the protection of the integrity of the wetland itself. So the first tool I'm gonna show you. So here you are, you've received an application and you need to determine whether or not there might be wetland concerns. This is the easiest way that you can do this. If nothing else, please do this. The wetland program realized that there were a lot of challenges to identifying wetlands if they're not mapped. And how do we support the general public in knowing whether or not there might be wetland concerns around their property or for planning purposes? So, the development of the wetland screening tool by our one and only Shannon Morrison in our wetland program, also a district ecologist. So in 2010, and this is why it came out, is prior to 2010, if the wetland wasn't mapped, it basically didn't exist. It wasn't jurisdictional. You could fill it in, you could build on top of it, you didn't need permits, there were no regulations. In 2010, our legislative folks realized that there were a lot of wetlands that were not mapped, that were worthy of protection, but the question remained is, well, then how does the public know this? And so we developed this screening tool in order to provide information accessibility. And that's because on our maps, you need to have a certain level of mapping skills. You have to know what layers to turn on to see if there might be a red flag. Then you have to interpret those layers and know if it actually means anything real for your project. There's those inherent inaccuracies in mapping or absence of mapping. And what does that tell you? That there is no wetland there? And now we have the ability to do photo interpretation, and we can use new tools that have been developed over the last, 30, 40, 50 years, such as LiDAR and, infrared and aerial interpretation. So there's just a lot more available to us. And so basically, what we wanted to be able to do is somehow take our brain, the district ecologist brain, and all the information that we know when we're doing a desktop review and somehow convey it to everyone else. That's you, everyone else. And the wetland screening tool is one way in which we're attempting to do this. So where is the wetland screening tool and how do you do it? So the wetland screening tool is off of our website, and I'm going to go right to our homepage. But if you type in, Vermont wetlands, you can come to our wetland program. If you could put in Vermont wetland screening tool, it'll bring you to it. And when you click on it, it's going to open up this cute little window. And then you're going to put in your address. So right now it's empty. It's waiting for you to input some information. You put in the address of the parcel in question, property in question, or the span number. So not all properties have been assigned a span number. If the property hasn't been developed, maybe it was recently subdivided, etc. So you type in an address, which I did here, and it gives you a wetland screening result, which indicates that there could be some wetlands on the property or near the property that somebody should be aware of. And so in this case, it tells me that the span number is for this property, who right now is considered the owner on tax documents, and then who the district ecologist is to contact. And then these are the different reasons for why this property was identified as having potential wetland concerns. That there's been an issued permit on the property, that in this case, there was a class 1 or class 2 designation or decision, that there was a project within 500 feet of the property boundaries. There has been wetland permits issued to other properties within 1,000 feet of this parcel, that there are some mapped wetlands in or near the property, in this case within 300 feet. We're going to come back to this property. So just remember what our wetland screening tool said is, hey, red flag, you should probably be asking questions before you proceed. Okay, let's see if this will work. Voila, yes. Okay, so we just brain dumped our desktop review in your hands, that you should probably get in touch with us before you issue a decision on funding. And what is the purpose of desktop reviews? So you could just use the wetland screening tool and then pass it on to us looking for more information. Or if you feel comfortable yourself, you can start using some of these other tools to provide some basic information. Now on the left, this is the image that you would have found on the Wetland Inventory Atlas. And then in Google Earth, I kind of just outlined the boundaries of where I'm really seeing some distinct changes in vegetation to a new vegetation. It looks like it's slightly indented in comparison to the surrounding area. And so I provided just a little more clarity or refinement of where I think the wetland boundaries would be. Please note that a desktop review is not a substitution for on the ground, in field work, and any line I draw on a map through a desktop review is not meant to be a wetland delineation. It is not a boundary until it's been field verified. But reviews can be like, well, yeah, we've got these, polygons, but first of all, some of them I think are in the wrong places, and it should have been shifted over here. And actually, the wetland probably continues along this drainage swale, and it looks like it could also maybe go out into this field where there's, some bare ground or some areas of potential inundation. So it might just be like, yeah, hey, be aware that I think this may end up being wetland, so you should be thinking about that. And in some of our programs, you can use tools to do measuring, and you can slap on a 50-foot or a 60-foot or a 75-foot buffer to also say, and this is probably where the buffer would come out. So if you're planning on doing stormwater here, you want to be away from this feature. And then in other cases, your desktop review might be to actually clear a property of any wetland concerns, even if it was mapped. So the green was mapped as wetland, the brown was mapped as hydric soils, which have a higher likelihood of supporting wetlands because they're inherently poorly drained and have those hydric soil characteristics already. And this landowner called me up. He's a potential buyer and says, I want to buy this property, but I'm concerned about how close the wetlands are to the house and the outbuilding, and whether or not I could do renovations or add a garage or et cetera, et cetera. So I did a desktop review, and I'm going to show you how powerful Street View can be. But by utilizing Street View as well as some of the other programs, this was my desktop review summary. That, yeah, there's a lot of wetland mapping, but it's actually not accurate. And in fact, I would be surprised if there's even any wetland at all. There might be a small fringe amount directly along the stream, but anywhere close to the house, no, there is no wetland. And that's because I could see the vegetation using Street View, and all that vegetation was upland. It was sumac was the big giveaway. So it comes back to those three parameters. You have to have hydrology. Well, there's a stream on the property. You have to have hydric soils. Well, there are mapped hydric soils, so that could be true. Hasn't been ground truthed, but we think they are there. And then wetland vegetation. Well, the wetland vegetation wasn't present. Therefore, there isn't a wetland there. But what happens when nothing is mapped? And you're looking at this and you're like, oh, okay, I don't think there's any problems. Well, so first of all, if you see a project star, then that means that one of us in our program has probably done some type of review on this property, and you should get in touch. If you looked across the street and there was some mapped stuff, in proximity to this, then that might be enough to raise a red flag. This is the property that I put in the wetland screening tool that I just showed you. And if you remember, there ended up being 6 or 7 reasons why there were red flag for wetland concerns on this property, even though nothing on it was mapped. So we will continue to come back to this property because it's a great example. So the Wetland Atlas. If you're going to take it upon yourself to do a desktop review, you can go to the ANR Atlas, the Agency of Natural Resource Atlas. That is a clearinghouse for all of the layers possible in the state. Fish and wildlife, hazardous waste, stormwater, bridges and culverts, wetlands, you name it, Act 250. You can access that all on the ANR Atlas. But if you're using the ANR Atlas, that means that you need to know what layers to turn on in order to do a comprehensive desktop review for wetlands. Or you can use our Wetland Inventory Atlas. So another tool available to you, which has all of these layers already turned on for you, and it's ready to go. So Let me see if I can do this. Oh, it doesn't like me. It's thinking. Okay, hold on. Done this to me before. Like it has to think too hard. So, Wetland Inventory Atlas. This is also accessible from our website. So coming back to our website, look up, Vermont Wetlands, Wetland Program. It'll bring you to our website. It's not pretty. It's pretty Unitarian. But down here, you can click on the Wetlands Inventory Map, and it is going to launch that program for you with a disclaimer that reiterates that this does not substitute a ground truthing, that this is informational purposes only, that it's not meant to be accurate. It's meant to help you identify red flags. And you have to acknowledge that because we do actually have consultants and engineers who will take these polygons directly off of the A&R Atlas and slap them onto their site plans and say, yep, we're 50 feet away from the wetland, when that's not true at all. So this is the A&R Atlas, and when you open up the layers, you can see all of the layers that have already been loaded into this program. And then as you start to scroll in, or you type in an address to where you want to go, I'll just pick one that I've done before. I don't even know where it's going to take us, so this is like Christmas. If you put in an address, then you're going to zoom to that by clicking on the feature actions. Anytime that you have an arrow, it means that if you click on it, you'll get additional information. The 3 dots will allow you to zoom to the feature. So here I am. Well, that's not very exciting. And when you start zooming in, let's go find an actual, here we go. Let's go to this one. Then as these layers become present, they'll start lighting up. And so you can scroll in and out. These big blotches are obnoxious. What's missing right now is this wetland map used to have a slider bar. It was there yesterday. It is missing today. We are hoping it's going to be back there tomorrow. That it would allow us to slide these and make them translucent. In the absence of that, all of these big blobs are under Fish and Wildlife for either natural resource communities or rare, threatened, or endangered species. So for our purposes, I'm just going to I'm going to turn it off so that we can see where our wetlands and hydric soils actually are. These little dots are vernal pools. And here we've got some wetlands that I've identified. Here we've got some hydric soils. And so you can zoom in and check things out. And here's the tip. Anytime that you are interested in a particular layer, then you can do the right click on your mouse, find data, and it will give you all the data that happens to be there. The parcel is by default always going to come up first. If you go back, it's going to also list any other attribute under that parcel. And then you can get more information. We'll go through this a couple of times throughout this presentation. But if, for example, you wanted to know, oh, what is that green dot? If you just left click it, you're going to get a result button here that says you have 2 results, 1 of 2. The parcel is always going to come up, or you can scroll over and it's going to highlight that if there's an advisory layer, it's a wetland, and you can look for additional details. And when you do details, it'll open it up and it's going to give you some information about what it is, when it was mapped, how it might have been mapped, maybe what type it is. It might tell you the year it was done, etc. So left click allows you to get the result box, whereas the right click find data gives you the same information, but over here, and the parcel by default always comes up, and you have to back up in order to see the rest of the list. So in this case, the advisory layer comes up. If you click on it, it's going to highlight it. And then if I want more information, I can open it up. So depending on how much detail you want, or you simply don't know what a feature is, that is how you are able to garner that information. All right, slideshow. Let's see. So back to this slide. If you go on the A&R Atlas, you have to turn on all these layers. If you go to the Wetland Inventory Atlas, the layers are already turned on for you. And so this just gives you an example that we just walked through. The purple outline is always going to be a natural community. And if you click on it, it will give you that information. And when it says things like floodplain forest, riverine forest, uh, uh, a bog, then you know that it's a wetland. So also on those maps, you saw the project star. I pointed that out on the parcel that didn't have any mapping. Project stars are really useful. That means that somebody from our program did some type of review either on or near that parcel. And we can often get information from our project folders and files and provide that to you because it's public information. In this case, I had a consultant reach out to me because they were developing a 3-acre stormwater project. I know you folks are also involved with stormwater projects, or at least the small scale. So if you see project stars, reach out and say, what can you tell me about this parcel? Or this is where we want to do our project. Is there any wetland concerns we should know about? And in this case, there were 4 wetland projects on the parcel, and I was able to provide, in one case, a delineation from 2019, which was really relevant to their design and the location of where they wanted to put their infrastructure. And so, as I mentioned, anytime that you right click or left click on a feature, including our project stars, you can look for additional information. So the first thing that comes up is that you'll have a project number. That is the number that we would use to look it up in our database. If absent of that, a span number or a 911 address or GPS coordinates is what we're looking for in order for us to do a desktop review. In the case of stars, if you click on them, you will get the project number, and that will allow us to look up that information immediately. And the type of information that we might have is whether a permit has been issued on that property, whether there were wetlands identified, and if so, what classification were those wetlands? If it was pre-2010, those class 3 wetlands might now be considered class 2 because of the rule change. That's important. If we have delineations on file, that helps give you really clear understanding of where wetland and buffer boundaries are, and then any other decisions that might have come out of our review. So this comes back to the A&R Atlas mapping is inaccurate. And to get a better understanding as to how or why, it's because back in the day, they only used the tools that were available to them. And so a study was done to see, based on the mapping, if people went out and actually did ground truthing, would it match up? Or how badly off was it? How inaccurate really was it? And they found that accuracy was related to wetland size. So for those wetlands that were less than or equal to 3 acres, 82% of the time they were omitted from those mapping programs. And for those that were between 3 and 20 acres, 68% of those were missing. And for those wetlands that were greater than 20 acres, and we do have some in Vermont, I'm going to take you there in a little while. The area or the extent of the wetland coverage shown on the map was grossly overestimated by 83% of the time. And then once again, back to our previous slide of the wetland types. Accuracy was related to the wetland types identified as well. So the forested wetlands are the most difficult to photo interpret. You can't see the ground for the trees. All tree crowns look, for the most part, relatively similar, so hard to tell. But then also the emergent wetlands, especially when they're in and around our agricultural fields, because there's no contrast in tone or in texture, which might provide a signature of red flag could be wetland, was missing. And so they were omitted from the mapping. So those were missed by about 79% of the time, and the forested wetlands were missed by about 64% of the time. So that's important. So when I keep coming back to not all jurisdictional wetlands are mapped, this helps you understand just how many wetlands might have been missed in any given area. And so we're going to come back to that lovely parcel back in Cambridge. The question is, so if there's no wetland mapping, that means there's no problem, right? So here we are. We're looking at the area outlined in yellow. I left the project star in place, so that in itself is a red flag. You should be contacting us. This was the actual delineation. Everything that has a dot ended up being wetland. What that turned into is this for wetland mapping on the parcel. So the person who had purchased this property and wanted to build, when we told them they needed to get a delineation before they could build, this is what they were left with in order to build their house and their septic. Their house is going where the star is, and their septic is going in that circle right in the middle of the wetland, pretty much within wetland buffers. So the answer is, if there's no mapping, could that still be a problem? And that's a big yes, it can be. So other clues for this property is across the street, there were mapped wetlands and mapped hydric soils, nearby ponds. Unless it is, I'll say, man-made and lined, pond level can often be a good indicator of your high groundwater table. And so, ponds that are filled up leads me to believe that, it could be an issue. And so I'm going to take you there. Let's see, I think. So here we are, Burn Road, Cambridge. This is the parcel in question. And in aerial view, nothing really jumps out. They have started their construction because this is a newer aerial. But if you use street side, and I'll go over again some of these tools and techniques, but if I drop myself on street side, I can look around, and here's my property in question. And there's a nice gap, so I'm able to actually scroll in and take a look. That are cattails. So that's a red flag, but it could just be a leftover man-made pond. So I'm going to just move around a little bit, and I'm going to see if I can get, some different views. And right here, that looks suspicious. So if I move up the road just a touch more, and I scroll in, those are cattails, and all around it, these bright green, those are your sensitive ferns. These shrubs just based on how foofy they are. I know, really scientific, right? But they're foofy. And a lot of times our willow will take on this sort of fuzzy foofiness to their structure. So just doing a desktop review, I could drop myself down, look out across the land and say, I've got some real wetland concerns. You know, dear Mr. Smith, before you proceed with your house and local permitting, you need to get this property delineated. And that brings you back to what actually was upland and what was not. I'm going to try the slideshow again. So basically, I was standing here and I looked up and I could see cattails over here. And then I looked down and I could see cattails over here and all the sensitive fern all down in this area. Now, I did not do a site visit, so I don't know what some of the other signatures up here might have been. But just doing a desktop would have been enough for me to at least raise a red flag to say there might be wetland concerns. So we know our mapping is bad, inaccurate. It's as good as it can be. What we're really hoping for is that it's going to get better. And so we have, the wetland program has been getting EPA funding to actually work on updating our wetland mapping, utilizing all of these new tools. So color infrared, photo imagery, aerial imagery, using LiDAR, looking and consolidating soils, going out and actually doing field review and incorporating field data into modeling programs. And this is the expected time frame for when that mapping is going to be added on to our VSWI map. And so you're going to be seeing changes over the year for the level of mapping that might be present in an area, which is really exciting. It does not substitute using other tools like Street View to help determine wetland absence or presence. And it certainly doesn't replace on the ground in-field evaluation, but we are hoping that our updating of wetland mapping can serve the public well and you in the capacities that you hold.
Zach, can we pause for just a moment? We have a question in the chat from Isabel, and she was wondering if you have any suggestions on guides for plant ID with these mapping tools. Isabel says she's used to being on the ground looking closely at the plants to do that identification.
So yes, if you're a geek, then any number of different plant books is lovely. If you like to key things out and spend more time in the field, which is a great excuse, or things like Plant ID, iNaturalist, where you can use your phone and at least get it into species to allow you then to look it up. There are a couple of Vermont specific books. They're very small. I don't remember their names, but it's like Shrubs of Vermont and like Flowers and Plants of Vermont. I think the author's last name might be Kelly. I'm not positive. And they're just, you know, they fit in your pocket. I mean, there are certainly really great botany books out there, but they tend to be, you know, 2-inch tomes with all of the keying out. You don't need to spend that much time to identify every plant out there. And in fact, I don't. You need to be able to recognize the most common ones. And I can go through a few of those in a bit once we get through the presentation. But you know, a lot of the plants are going to be repetitious from one site to the next, and usually, unfortunately, the types of wetlands we're most likely to be coming into contact with around water quality projects, urban areas, are going to be not the the most happy wetlands. So you may have some invasive species, purple loosestrife, or like things like sensitive fern, boneset, uh, Joe Pye weed, things like that, where you just start to recognize them because they're so repetitious. But we can get back into some additional strategies for identification in a little bit. So going back to the Vermont inventory map, if you remembered, I had clicked on the layers to show you all the different layers that were available, and I turned off the fish and wildlife one. Well, every time that there's a plus, that means that you can expand it and that there's additional either information or tools that you can utilize. And so in this case, you could have color imagery by year, or by opening this up, having different base maps, which you can access here. And that's my preferred method because of the slider bar, or access down here. But that means that it immediately becomes the solid background for whichever one you've chosen. But they are really great, great options. And I'm going to get into some of each one of these in a little bit more detail as we progress. I'm going to first just sort of introduce so that you can see it and recognize it and get a sense as to what the tool allows you to do. And then we'll get into a little bit more of the specifics. So in the Vermont inventory map, you have the ability of looking at imagery between years 2003 and 2016 in increments. And you can also change your background or your base maps. And LiDAR is key because it really helps to provide definition of the features on the ground showing topographic relief. For those of you that have access to Google Earth Pro, so I know all of our state employees do, utilize it and utilize its history button. So it's the same thing as the Vermont Vermont mapping, where you have different snapshots from different years. Utilizing these history buttons really allows you to look for hydrologic signatures, consistent ones. You can see land use changes and how that may have influenced hydrology on the landscape. You can see where there has been consistently unmowed or uncropped or stunted crop growth over different years. You can start picking out those patterns when you go from one year to the next, to the next, to the next. In Google Earth Pro, you can utilize the Street View if Google Maps has Street View. It's pulling from the most current year. If you're using it, that's fine, but do also use the normal Google Maps program, the internet-based, available to everyone program, and the Big Bing Maps program, also internet-based, available to everyone. And that's because under Google Maps Internet, you actually might have different years, different accessibility, and sometimes different photos. And especially between Google Maps and Bing Maps, it's a big thing because wherever Google Maps does not go, Bing Maps tends to go. Google Earth Pro also allows you to use a tilting ability to view topography and possible drainage. And so I'm going to attempt to show you what I mean. So here's Google Earth Pro. Here is your history button, which will open up your history bar. And I will show you a static version of this in a moment. But it allows you to click on each one of these white lines that will give you a snapshot of that time. The furthest one back is usually in the 1990s. And I came to this area in Moncton, so Bristol Pond, Lake Winona, Route, That's not even 116. It's Bristol Road that connects from Bristol through Moncton up to Heinsberg. First of all, nobody taught me this until, well, they didn't teach it to me soon enough. Whenever you start moving around and your tilting starts to get wonky and you just want to be able to look straight down again, go to View, Reset, Tilt and Compass, and it'll bring you right back into bird's eye view. Don't waste your time trying to tilt yourself back. It's a losing battle. However, the tilting ability is a good one. But before we go there, let's take a look at 1993. So this was really open water. You can still see pretty much where the wetland is along this edge. The beauty of 1990 imagery is the black and white. It really makes your water features pop. And then as you go up, of course, as time goes on, your resolution of your imagery tends to change. Some years are better than others. Sometimes you have fog or cloud cover. The big ones tends to be, and I'm jumping right to it, 2011 tends to be really good. Also tends to be in the fall. I'm surprised this one isn't. And then 2015 tends to be leaf off. And again, I'm surprised this one isn't. Leaf off is important, and I'll come back to that because there's another way that you can utilize leaf off. If you don't have Google Pro, you still now have the ability to view things leaf off statewide. So you can look at the history button, you can close it, which will bring you back to its most recent. But what's nice is that you can also spin yourself around. And so if you wanted to see something from a different perspective, you can start moving yourself around. And then you can also start to tilt. And when you start to tilt, that's when your topography really starts to show. So I did it here because you can see that this wetland has formed within the basin of this hill slope going down and that hill slope going down. Where is water most likely to concentrate? It's water runs downhill. I would expect to find wetland at the TOA slope of both of these slopes feeding into this valley. Conversely, I am not surprised that there is such a huge wetland complex along here because this is a big ridge of mountains that go down and it's all feeding into this valley and this stream. So tilting can be a really great tool in order to show you some of that topography and nuances that goes to questions of drainage patterns and where water is most likely to concentrate. In combination with the history button, that can be a pretty powerful tool. And we're going to try going back to the slideshow. Okay. So just as a reiteration, there's your history button. 1990 imagery is your black and white. And here, actually, you can see it. So I chose Williston, the Taft Corners, Home Depot, Walmart. And you can really see the difference from basically 1999 to 2015, the development that's happened. Now, I would have assumed that there was wetland here with this inundation and drainage pattern. There might be, there's like a little stream right here that's going on too. And where this is, that's back over here near Dick's Sporting Goods. That's exciting. Okay. For those of you that say, well, yeah, that's great, but I don't have Google Earth Pro. So now what? That's where all of these other tools come in. And I will make sure that you get these links. I'll either put them in the chat or I will consolidate them and send them out to you. I'm also going to show you them on the internet. But the historical aerials is new. And depending on your location, so what address you put in will dictate the number of years of imagery that's available to it in what range it's available. So the range can be between 1960 and about 2020. You also, this is what I said about leaf off. There is now brand new imagery almost statewide for 2022 imagery that has leaf off. There's also a standalone program to access the 1962 black and white imagery. So again, it's really great for having those hydraulic signatures pop out. And then, as I mentioned before, in utilizing our tool, the wetland inventory map, you can do that color imagery by year under that layers section. And so let's see.
Just want to say quickly that Kate Kelly mentioned that Google Earth Pro should be free, or it used to be, but she recommends Googling that to get Google Earth Pro.
Okay, great, thank you. So remember, you have your wetland screening tool, which gives you red flags. Then you have our wetland inventory, which in our layers section, you can scroll up and down. Here is your imagery by year. You would open it up. You would turn it on. And then we can, so pick a spot on the map, keep watching it. Ta-da! Okay, watch it again. And so it takes you back to the early 2000s to 2016. And so you can see whether or not maybe an area that was slightly suspicious because it looked like maybe there had been some standing water. You can click through and see if that seems to be a persistent pattern. You know, an area that hasn't been mowed. You can see if that's been consistent. The reason why somebody doesn't mow an area is it's either too wet or it's got rocks. When I'm thinking like farmers. So if they want as much space as possible, and there is a real reason why they aren't utilizing that space, and that tends to be the two issues, either bedrock, ledge, or their pile of rocks, or water. So this is the wetland inventory. You can turn it, you can also, so the current one is always present. These are layers that go on it, which means that the sliding bar allows you to fade it in and out, which can allow you to see if there is maybe some consistent patterns overlapping each other. You can also go down to base maps. Again, plus opens them up, and hillshade. But notice that nothing happened. And you're like, okay, well, come on, work for me. That's because these base maps are being covered by your layer. You have to turn that layer off. And then voila, you've got your LiDAR. And so these areas that are in stark relief are higher than the areas adjacent to it. Sometimes you can see how it slopes down and in. This is really helpful for identifying your topography, your drainage patterns, your areas of depression, even micro topography. So areas that might end up looking really rough could be an indication of wetlands. And as you scroll in, those features of roughness, drainage pattern become even more and more distinct. And again, the reason why I open it under base maps here is because then I'm able to fade in. If I just looked at this, I probably would not have thought that there was some drainage going through it. Maybe right here, it kind of shows, maybe right here. But when I bring it up, it really becomes pretty clear that there is certainly a depressional area moving through this non-mowed area surrounded by field. Plus you have a pond. So there may be a high groundwater table also. Here's some hydrology signatures, some saturation. Just because it shows up in one image does not mean it's wetland. Just because an area is covered with hydric soils does not mean it's wetland. So let me be clear that the Champlain Valley is not one big wetland because of its clay soils. However, clay is poorly drained, so wetlands are likely to form on hydric soils. So if I looked over here, and I'm seeing some of these funky depressions, let's just bring up LiDAR, and you can very much see that boundary. You can see that boundary as well. And then that's what the house up on Phil. And if I bring it back down, you can really see where those features overlap. Now, as I mentioned, there is supposed to be a slider bar here, which would allow you to make these layers transparent, the same way I've been using the other slider bars. That should be returning soon, and I apologize that it's not here today. However, you can also turn things on and off if they're in the way of being able to see the ground. This is your classic, just Google Maps, and you type in your address and it goes wherever. What's nice about this is, obviously you can spin around, you can take a look, but you can also drop yourself down. Anytime, let me go back. Anytime you go to grab yourself, if the road is blue, you can drop yourself on it. If the road is gray, you cannot. So you can drop yourself on it, start looking around and potentially see if there's any issues. If there are more dates available that have photo imagery available, you click on it and it'll come up down below. It'll give you the year, and by clicking on it, it will give you the requisite photo image. Now, obviously, some of them are better than others. What's nice is that sometimes they're in different times of the year, and you can actually learn a lot from seeing them at different times of the year. Here I'm seeing that the land goes up, sort of has this like little plateau, and it starts to slope back down. You sort of see a toe slope kind of like right about here, going around like this, and then fading off over this direction. Let's see if that's consistent. Oh, so this is a little more brown as opposed to the green, so perhaps a little drier. And then you can really kind of see that hump of the land when all the grass is down, because the topography, really starts to pop up. What's nice is that I can also see water right here, which is not intuitive. But why would there be water there? That's a good question. Remember this image, we're going to come back to it. And this happens to be in the fall. And so we can actually, really kind of get a sense as to some of the species that might be around. What I like about this, which one? This imagery, pretty green. And then as we start getting out, you can really see a very distinctive change in vegetation back in here. And it's shown by color. Now, this was in July, so there could be something going on. But it would cause me to ask, why is there a change in vegetation? Why is this area turning brown when this other area is not? Is there something I should be looking for? For Bing Maps, we already saw this with Bernier. Now, when I looked up the Berner Road, that parcel that had no mapping, in Google Maps, there was no imagery. But Bing Maps gave it to me, and it gave me just enough of a view shed to raise a red flag that there might be concerns. So We also have the 1962 imagery. There's two different. This one's really, really high resolution, and as you can see, there's not statewide coverage. This one here has statewide coverage. It's called the Collection H. And you open it up and it gives you this grid pattern. So it's hot pink until you start rolling in, and then it starts to become your cute little dots. The one thing that is not helpful with this is that you kind of need to know where you're going to go. You do have some road names, but they're not all labeled. And you sometimes need to be looking at two things at the same time to be able to line up the features to know where you are and what you're looking at, because it's on a grid system. You're not going right to a property. But when you do click on any one of the pink dots, you can open it up. And this is the important part. Oh, cool. Hopefully all of you can now recognize that this would be an area of wetland concern. Anytime you open up any of these photos that I'm going to be showing you in these next tools, do a save image as. And the reason for that is here, this is as far as it can be zoomed in. So, small, large, small, large. But if you save it as a photo or as an image, then it allows you to scroll in as far in as you want. You do lose some resolution as obviously you get closer, but sometimes this isn't quite enough to maybe want to see what's really going on here, and you want to be able to zoom in just a little bit more. Save as image allows you to do that. It also allows you to save it into, say, a project folder or file to be used later, or to attach to an email for someone. So 1962 imagery is always black and white. Clearly you can see where some of the hydrology is, and it's popping out like mad. You can also do that historical aerial where you would put in an address. I'm going to do mine just because I know where it is. And when you put in an address and you do aerials, it will give you the years that are available to see. Now, clearly, this is not Ripton. You have to click on one of the years in order for it to load. And so depending on what your address is, it might go from 1986 to 2019. Oh, it's going to be, that looks better. So 1961 to 2019. So again, depending on your address, it clearly needed to know I was in Vermont. When you click on it, it will bring up your imagery, and then you can zoom in accordingly. For this one, you actually can zoom in as much as you want, and then you can use like a print screen or a snipping tool in order to capture an image and save it, or be able to draw on it. So say up here, and I can tell you because it's near my property, this is a beaver dam. Now it pops up as hydrology anyway, but maybe I needed to circle something so I could share it with Angie Allen and say, you could do your project over here, but I'm going to circle this. This is definitely wetland, or this would be an area that you should ground truth. So it can be used in which to communicate as well. And as you change years, the background changes as well, getting into your 1990s, which is your black and white. And lo and behold, the beavers weren't there back then. And I know that's true also. And it's now kind of sort of grown in because the beavers have left. So which is fun. You also have, this is the 2022, so you can always tell what year it is over here in this corner. And it shows you the grid system for the area that is available. So unfortunately, those of you that are working in the Northeast Kingdom, you've been left out again in inappropriate accurate mapping, but it's the same process. So you scroll into wherever you want to go. And thankfully, they actually have a background that really does give you your names, including the small ones. And then once you click on one, so it highlights your grid, then you can download. This larger file is really funky. It almost looks like it was taken in winter. You want the smaller one. And it's going to download it onto your computer, and however that's set up for your computer. For mine, it downloads in the bottom, and then I can open it up from here. And so when I open it, it'll launch it, as a photo. And then you can zoom in accordingly because it has downloaded and opened up as a photo. And so I can keep zooming in, zooming in, zooming in. There's that cute little beaver pond right there, where it has shrunk down. So, and this is leaf off. So 2022, you can really, really see the lay of the land. There's a lot of evergreen in the Green Mountains, and that's where I'm at. So, but this can be really useful if you don't have 2015 imagery or Google Earth Pro. All right, so those are the tools, and those are how to access them and how to use some of the different methods of different years, leaf off, etc. Are there any questions about some of these tools and how to access them? Okay.
It looks like Dean just made a point about another source of historic images, and he put a link into the chat, but he said it's much more hit or miss, and not all those images are geo-referenced.
Okay, great. Well, it is. It's about networking. It's about sharing our resources, and it's about supporting each other. So if you find something good, pass it on. So I'm just going through these, really quickly again, just to remind you of what each one looks like, and what it provides. So there's the historic to almost current imagery we just went over. Here's that leaf off imagery. I zoomed in really close to the beaver dam so that you can see all the downed trees. But you can also see, like, there's clearly a drainage right here, coming out of that pond. And this is very straight. So this is where the beaver dam is, and it's obviously draining out. And there's some type of hydrology coming in from the side this way. So having leaf off is actually really good. Black and white tends to pop out the hydrology, but leaf off in other cases can provide a similar ability to review. Okay, so this is that Dorset property that I dropped us down on in Google Earth, with that small hump of land. So this is from 1962, and I've circled things for reference. So all the circles are the same things that color across all three images. This was 1962 before I saved it and zoomed in. So it's kind of hard when I'm looking at this. It's like, well, what is that black dot? I don't know. What are those white dots in the orange square? I don't know. What's this going on? Wow, that's a funky looking strip. I can't even really see that slash line that clearly shows up. Now that's definitely a ditch. So I zoom in, and all of a sudden I realize, well, that's a pond. That's a red flag. That looks like some type of rock outcropping. This looks pretty wet. That looks pretty wet. This could be trees, but if not, that's pretty wet. There's a ditch clearly conveying water. So we don't waste our time by making ditches if they're not needed. So if there's a ditch, there's a reason. Generally, it's because there's water somewhere. This looks dark and ominous. Down here looks funky, kind of wettish. And then I get into Google Earth and then realize, like, oh, hey, they've built a house in there. Oh, the pond's still there. Oh, definitely wetland around it. So that pond had been created in wetland. Well, that doesn't surprise me, especially with what's around it. And you can really see a couple of distinctive vegetative breaks. You've got this one, and then you've got this one that wraps around. And then you've got this one that wraps around. Now, if you remember, we dropped ourselves on Google Earth right here, looking back out and seeing that topography that's higher than the surrounding land. That would correspond with this boundary right here. And again, you can see that in the other image that was available to us. And so, okay, so not even looking at wetland mapping, just doing a Google Earth and looking at this feature, I would already have some red flags, enough to ask some questions. So then I turn on the A&R Atlas. Okay, well, there's a project star. That's good. So our program probably has some information about this property. And if you notice, the wetland is mapped, covers the pond, so that's not surprising. Then they went back in and they refined the map by adding this advisory layer. This happy pink layer is our hydric soil. So it's not showing any wetlands over here at all, but look at that hydraulic signature. So that's interesting. But we have enough information to say, yeah, you really need to get this delineated before you plan on that subdivision or new barn or what have you. And this is what the wetland delineation looked like. So the turquoise is your wetland and the yellow is your 50-foot buffer. We almost could have predicted that just by doing a desktop review. Enough so from a planning standpoint, either plan on the fact that there is going to be wetlands there, or planning on the fact that you're going to need a delineation during the growing season. And so when you're looking at projects and project design and funding and deadlines, if you start seeing things like this, where a wetland delineation is really going to be needed in order to locate that stormwater project or to do an appropriate restoration plan, you don't want to be planting, red oak in a wetland. They're all going to die. So in which case you need to be planning on a delineation during the growing season. And that might shift your time frame or the ability for our program to give approval to a project that you're looking to fund, because our program is saying, well, you don't have enough information yet. I'm seeing these signatures that say, I'm pretty sure there's wetlands here. We need to do a site visit. I'm pretty sure there's a wetland here. You're going to need to do a delineation, etc. Okay, this is to remind me to take you there, but I did earlier, and I just wanted you to see the lay of the land, that hump, which for a street view actually allowed you to see, which doing a desktop review, bird's eye view, you often don't get to see that topography. And so bird's eye view, you saw the change in, vegetation, the change in coloration and vegetation, but you don't see that change in elevation that we were able to see from the street view. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about hydrologic signatures, but what are they? And just as a note, so coming back to tips and tricks, this is where your LiDAR, so drainage patterns, etc., black and white, and your infrared can be helpful. But there's other things to be thinking about. So are you seeing areas of inundation, darkening of an area of the landscape, darker than its surrounding area, where you would actually have physical water? Then you have saturation, and that can also appear as dark areas on the landscape because the soils are water laden and they're reflecting back differently. Those drainage patterns, water has to go somewhere, and wetlands will follow drainage patterns, or they will be, I say, at the end of your drainage pattern. And I have an example that Ethan worked on that I will share. That geomorphic position, right? So at the bottom of your drainage patterns, those depressions that we could see. Other things, If you are looking to propose a project on a road that contains the word swamp, bog, river, beaver, I can guarantee you that there is some type of wetland along that road. Where? I don't know. It could be that the whole road goes through the wetland. So think of Cornwall. Cornwall has the swamp road. Well, it bisects Cornwall Swamp. There's wetland on both sides of the road, the entire length of the road, compared to our cute little sign that's called Upland Drive. We probably don't have any concerns there. Other things is when you're talking with the applicant or the landowner, you know, we need to replace this culvert. That means that there's water there. I'd like to build a stormwater pond in this low area, geomorphic position. There's a lot of erosion happening here. There's presence of water. It's usually wet in the spring, but it dries up in the summer. Well, if it's wet in the spring, is it wet for 2 weeks out of the spring? Oh, I can only get one cut of hay off this field now. That's because precipitation in Vermont is going up and these marginal areas are getting wetter and wetter. So I often hear, well, it didn't used to be this wet. I agree. It used to not be this wet. It is this wet and it is getting wetter. And then the things like, well, I'd like to get rid of the cattails and the lily pads so I can swim. I know some of your projects might be along our lake shores. We take jurisdiction out to 6.5 feet deep in areas that are dominated by rooted vegetation, including cattails, lily pads, burr reeds, etc., which means that the 50-foot buffer extends onto the upland land from the edge of the wetland, which could be at the edge of the water. You obviously have to deal with, you know, shoreline encroachment and lake regulations as well, but recognize that there may be dual jurisdiction with wetlands also. So just as a kind of a reiteration, 1962 black and white imagery, 1990 series, and there you go. So here's some of your, you know, hydrologic signatures. I would say soil saturation, but then down here, your squiggle, squiggle, squiggle. Oh, Stacy, it's a happy stream. It's got sinuosity. But it pops, and there's your hydrology. So it's not going to surprise me if there's wetland along that stream, or should be. So if there's not, it's a great place for a restoration. So this is our Dorset Street again. And when I look at black and white, you can really see this darkening of this area here. You can see the ditch here. You can see patches. Clearly, there's a change in vegetation. It gets really dark up here. Now, these are trees, which our street view gave us confirmation immediately. Here it is in color infrared. And so again, it really shows that that there's something going on here different than what's happening immediately next to it. And that ditch pops out again, and you can really see some of the nuances, you know, like there's water flow, drainage going through here and more concentrated flow. Same with here. This might have been an old ditch. It's pretty straight, that goes straight up. Some more drainage here. And then there's the pond in both photos that really pop clearly. So that's what I mean about drainage or hydrologic signatures. Now for hydric soils, I already gave you the disclaimer that not all hydric soils mean that there's wetlands there. You can get the hydric soils on the A&R Atlas. That's probably the easiest, but you can also get them through NRCS. You can download their layers and have them as a layer on your Google Earth. I have a hard time with that. It tends to crash my program. But you can, you know, there's different ways of being able to view hydric soils. And while I do hydric soils, I'm doing it in combination with all of the other desktop review that we've been going over. Now, the hydric soils are coming from NRCS. We took their information and we created it as a layer under our mapping. That's the Natural Resource Conservation Service. They were particularly done in order to support farming. they're through the USDA, or were through the USDA. So while it's pretty comprehensive, it's not finite, so it's not really refined. There's still big polygons. So we lose the nuance that, this area could be hydric and this area over here is not. You also have it where there are gradations of hydric soils. So not all soils are created equal, in which case, whenever going back to clicking on your polygons, you can get more information. And when they have a number and then they have a letter, you can get additional information. And that information refers to the type of soil it is. It's a Covington clay. It's a muck peat soil. It's I only know my wetland soils. Isn't that awful? But you find out your information, and they're classified also by how wet they tend to be. So if you're finding, when you open it up and it says wetland indicator type obligate, that means that it's usually mucks and peats, ponded, flooded, marsh, emergent wetland, i.e. really wet. Whereas other descriptors would say FAC wet, typically often associated with wetland formation, or just hydric. Now, just hydric means that they're poorly drained, because remember, it links back to primarily agricultural use. They also will correspond with our septic designs. They're poorly drained. That means that by default, they are more likely to support wetland formation because they're more likely to keep water and not allow that water to drain away. But that doesn't mean that there is a wetland there, just because they've been categorized as a hydric soil. You actually have to take soil samples and be looking for those characteristics. If you remember, the mineral soils would be gray. You might see some rust or redox formations in the soils. They might be, if they're peat and mucky, they're going to be really dark and black. So those cool brown colors is what we're looking for. So this is a perfect example that just because you have hydric soils, which are all shown as this light purple color, Covington and Panton clays, they're the bane to my existence, and they're found throughout the Champlain Valley. Just because they're present does not mean that there's wetlands. So our mapping, so here's the pond. Our mapping shows that there's wetlands coming up and into the pond, and then it stopped. And then revised mapping said, no, really, the wetland continues all the way up through. And it sort of overlays the hydric soils. Then we have hydric soils that are going along the agricultural land. And then we have another stream, and somebody built a pond in the stream. Well, that's a red flag. And then there's stars. So again, if there's a star, we've done some type of review. So am I concerned about these fields? And what we looked at based on a desktop review and delineation was, no, actually we're not. So again, this is your pond and this is your pond. So the wetland definitely followed along the pond and down into this valley. Now they were really looking at this field for solar development. And so they really only did this edge that would be along the field to inform whether this field could support solar. But there's no wetland mapped within this area here. No wetland mapped except for the pond. And there's no wetland mapped going out in this direction, which is where this starts coming out. So this is this tree line right here, this tree line right here. And some of it is overlapping the hydric soils on this side and the area that were not picked up as hydric soils. So they are meant to be used as a tool. Hydric soils should be a red flag to start asking more questions. In and by themselves, does not mean that a wetland is present. Now, in lack of this delineation, if I was doing a desktop review and I turned on LiDAR, you can clearly see the pond and this very distinctive topographic break. So this is the low-lying area. The areas on both sides are much higher up. All the water is going to be running off of these fields into this low area. This low area is broad and flat. And if you look at it, oops, try again. Oh, hold on. And if you look at it, you can see that there's a lot of micro topography, and you can see the drainage that's happening. Same with this one. So much lower than the surrounding land. And you have micro topography, all the little bumpy bumpies. And so that is where I would predict that wetland occurred. Now, not exclusive. There's enough red flag that I would want to at least walk the field to ensure that that there isn't more wetland here. But I would at least start with, I can guarantee you 99% chance that you have wetland associated with these drainages. And you should be planning that at least, at the very, very least, as part of your project design. And you're going to need a wetland delineation. And so you need to plan accordingly for that. So back to, was it Kate, right? Kate, vegetation. So vegetation can play a huge role. This is Joe pieweed. It's got a whirl of leaves and this distinctive purple bloom. But whenever you're doing desktop reviews where you see a distinct change from one type of vegetation to another, areas that are not mowed with an otherwise mowed environment, or sometimes if you remember when I said I'm standing at Dorset and I'm looking across and we see how light brown it is out in the distance, sometimes those areas of very light tan will end up being areas of either reed canary grass, cattails, or phragmites, all three of which are wetland plants. And so they can become distinctive. And certainly in the fall, they can be very distinctive when you're doing a desktop review. So how does this play out? The other way in which vegetation comes into play is that a collection of species in a specific area can contribute to a state significant natural community type. So clay plain forests, silver maple, ostrich fern, floodplain forests, etc. They are outlined by purple. If you right click or left click on them, they will highlight and you can get additional information. In this case, everything that's highlighted in yellow is described as a red spruce cinnamon fern swamp. Well, that's an easy one. I can guarantee you it's wetland. The caveat to the natural community mapping is it's coming from the Fish and Wildlife. So just like the soils came from NRCS, the natural community mapping is coming from Fish and Wildlife. And consequently, it's done mostly on state-owned or public lands. It's occasionally done on private lands with permission, but therefore the layers are only as good as the information that we have. So just because an area is not being shown as a natural community type, it does not mean that that community type is missing. It just might mean that we didn't have, or Fish and Wildlife didn't have permission to be on the land to confirm presence, absence of that natural community. So vegetation can stand on its own to say, hey, look at me. There's a bunch of us here, and so we are a wetland, or they can act in combination with other species to actually form these very specific community groupings that can be identified. And Street View can help you. So this is Aubuchon Hardware located in Middlebury, and just dropping myself down on Route 7 and looking across, I could see that there were cattails all along this forested edge, and the majority of this field and running behind the building is all wetland. So I don't have to go to Aubuchon Hardware to know that there's wetlands on this property. I'm able to field verify it just from sitting in front of my computer. My field verification would come when there's actually a delineation and I would be confirming the accuracy of that wetland boundary. But I have no question at all that there is wetland on this property, and I can state that from a desktop review. I may not be able to tell the property owner what the size of it is or what it looks like as far as configuration, but I can tell with confidence that there is a wetland here. And so this would be an example of those areas that have not been mowed in an otherwise mowed environment. So on the left is the Google Earth imagery. On the right is the ANR Atlas. And in this case, the red and red striped is all the floodplain. So for those of you that are looking at floodplain restoration or river corridor easements, CREP program, etc., these would be things that you'd be looking for. So if you're in a floodplain, there can be any number of other restrictions at the local zoning level. But from a wetland standpoint, go ahead, Ethan. Okay. But from a wetland standpoint, things that I would be looking for is in this, you have mapped wetland to the south. And to orient you, this is the train track. And this is the train track. Oops, go back. And so we have mapped wetland down below, which would be, down here. And I don't, down here, it's even off the page, right? So it doesn't have any of this mapped as wetland. It does have it mapped as hydric soils, does have it mapped as floodplain. That's all good. And so they were going to be doing stormwater here. The town of Wallingford is part of their master plan, and they are identifying potential places for stormwater. And these were some of the areas. And so I did a desktop review, and I basically nixed them almost immediately because these were some of the red flags that popped up. And I said, well, we need to do a site visit because I'm pretty sure these areas are going to be wetland. And this is what it looked like. So it was alder swamp, sensitive fern, ditches, hydrology, and basically the flooding area of the Otter Creek. So was completely wetland and was completely not appropriate for stormwater infrastructure. So what are you guys involved with? All of these projects, you know them. I don't have to go through them. You have to go through a matrix of whether or not your project can be funded. And does it overlap with any of these types of resources? And if you're answering yes, first of all, if you're answering no, then automatically it's eligible. So let's go back to Cambridge. There was no wetland mapped, and the town wants to do some stormwater there as a water quality project. And the consultant says, yeah, we're good to go. And are they? We said, no, there's no wetlands. That's because there's no wetlands mapped. So there's no wetland concern. Does that make that project eligible? Well, yes, in your matrix, but in reality and ground truthing, as you saw, the answer is no, there is actually wetland there. In which case, then you have to answer the series of questions of what type of permitting might be needed, whether a permit can be obtained, and then ultimately whether or not funding can be granted. So examples on ag lands, there you have your stormwater and leachate treatments and manure storage for clean water, new infrastructure, animal trails and access roads can qualify as water quality projects, conversion or forestry, restoration, which also leads into, leased or easement areas, etc. So Ethan will recognize this. This was Elephant Gully on 116 in Middlebury. And the question was, is it eligible for funding? Are there any wetland concerns? If there are, can we approve it as restoration? Do we need a delineation? Do we need any permitting? Can it be avoided? And so I tried to stay organized, you guys. You have to give me kudos for this. Okay. I'm going to drop myself down because this is actually an awesome project. Here it is. And that is all of the willow that has grown up as part of the soft techniques, and it looks awesome. And then you can see that this is where the gully started to go down. So when Ethan asked me, I said, okay, so I did a desktop review and I was looking at LiDAR, I was looking at drainage patterns, and then I dropped myself down on Street View and I went down the road just a wee little bit, and there's the drainage. All through in here, dead and dying trees, low-lying areas, stream going through it, highland, topography on both sides, all the water runs downhill. Yeah, there's definitely a wetland here at the base of the topography. So we can see more dates just as a refresher of how to use this tool. And so you can look back and look at that. You can really see the stream now, and now the gully is coming down this way. And so the wetland basically wrapped around the topography that was allowing the gully to form. But I was able to go down, do a site visit, show them where the extent of the wetland was, pull 50 feet back, and all of the hard techniques, so the riprap and the log jams, were able to stay outside of the wetland and buffer. And so a permit wasn't needed. So, that's great. In other cases, we might have been able to approve it as a restoration with combination of hard techniques up top, lower and soft techniques like willow, wattles, etc. In the lower part of the slope would have been a creative solution for the same project. Or maybe based on the project purpose and the need for it, we could approve it, but it would have required a permit. So regardless, my desktop review allowed me to at least say, yes, there is a wetland here. Yes, we do need to do a site visit. Yes, you need to plan accordingly. And so this is the LiDAR. And so this is the gully that comes down right here, like that. And then this is the wetland that basically follows Toa Slope, and it actually broke right about here and kind of came around, and then it, as you can tell, there's a little bit higher here. It wrapped itself around and came down like this to kind of skirt the stream. And so that just gives you, all I did was translucent it so you could sort of see some of the vegetation behind it. But I was able to give Ethan an answer almost immediately as to whether or not there might be wetland concerns. River corridor easements. I was approached by one of the river scientists, and they said, we have a willing landowner. We want to develop a river corridor easement. We think up here we should definitely be including, we can see some old oxbows. But Zap, what do you think about this area? And through a desktop review, and then also dropping myself down Street View on Route 100, we determined that this area internally wasn't worth it, but this was, because it was all naturally vegetated and it was actually conveying water. And so it was serving a higher water quality protection. And that ended up being the proposed river corridor easement, inclusive of those wetland areas. For those of you involved with restoration, just as a reminder, under the layers on the Vermont Atlas, the wetland inventory atlas, we do have the wetland restoration potential layer, which lights your screen up quite nicely. You can right click on them and see the information associated with them. If you have specific questions about this, you can tap me later. I won't get into it, but just know that it is a layer that's available to those that are involved with restoration specifically. Okay, anything that says, river corridor easement, that means there's water. Stormwater projects, that means it's because of water. If you have water, that means you might have hydrology. And so if you're involved with 3-acre rules, if you're involved with municipal master plans, if there's new development, if there's, retrofitting for municipal systems, you should be taking a look, because water runs downhill and inevitably that's where the engineers want to put it. As an example, we have a subdivision where they need to outfit with stormwater. So there are a couple of discharge points, one up in this corner here, and then one in this corner here. Looking at this, are there any immediate concerns? Well, I'd be asking, okay, there you have the river there. Is there wetland along the river? This back here looks very suspicious. It looks like it's probably lower down than the field. It looks very bumpy. It looks like there's hydrology going on. So I would be concerned about this one also. Did a desktop review. Standing on the bridge overlooking East Creek, I could see the bench. You can very clearly see it here as I lifted up my head, so to speak, and you can see that there's a bench before the land starts going up. And so another view, this is Bing's. I could see what the vegetation was, and I told the engineer, I said, I need to confirm whether this floodplain area is actually wetland as well. And you can see that in the LiDAR, that change in elevation. And then that second discharge point, which was supposed to be between the two houses. So, and these are the two houses, two parcels. Mapped wetland, so that's a red flag. And then it looks like the same topography comes in like this. It may or may not come into this area, wraps around, which I'm assuming has been fill placed within wetland, not an uncommon situation. Wrapping around, and I would be concerned that there's water coming in from this direction and that the wetland actually comes up like this. Alternative mapping that would hopefully be part of our updated mapping at least extended the wetland to behind the house. Our site visit confirmed that it actually did come up this drainage. So both discharge points needed to be reevaluated. Okay, if you had failed septic system at the star, or the town wants to put in stormwater infrastructure, this is the VSWI map. So there is nothing more than a star. I didn't turn anything off. All the layers are on. Are there any concerns? If so, type them into the chat. I'll give you 10 seconds. Name one reason why you might be concerned. And Ethan, if you can read out a couple of them as they come in.
Sure. The star on the corner property, a change in vegetation, the wetland looking plants down center,
Yep.
brown vegetation.
Yep. Change in color, change in vegetation, star. Oops. Let's see. Hold on. That's our brown vegetation going up the center. It's all phragmites. So yes, I would agree. There's a real wetland concern there. And we're almost done. Hang in. Lake projects. Some of you are involved with stabilization, culvert to stormwater. So again, you're going to be doing your desktop review and asking yourself, what does the A&R Atlas tell us? What does Google Earth tell us? What does Street View tell us? There's a lot of stars around Little Lake. There's a reason why there's lots of stars around Little Lake. And there's lots of wetlands involved. So there was some stormwater projects that were specifically proposed in and around Little Lake to address some water quality and sedimentation issues. And so there was quite a bit of evaluation of whether or not wetlands were there. And so we were doing the same type of desktop reviews that we just walked through for each one of these sites. And we were able to pull things back where we needed to allow most of the projects to move forward. And this is just a little lake up by their parking area. And this actually is all wetland here. And it doesn't surprise you that you can kind of see that, again, change in vegetation. And then also I put this slide in because this is showing you jurisdiction where the wetland program would be taking jurisdiction out to where the dominance of these lily pads are. And consequently, even where there wasn't wetland right here in this field, there's a 50-foot buffer extending from the wetland that's occurring in the water that would come out into this field. And that would also dictate your design. If you're doing culvert replacements, they're usually on roads. Street view can be really, really good for culvert replacements. And you can be looking for things like here you've got some water, you can see a change in elevation, you can see a change in vegetation. If you're good, Kate, with your vegetation, you can see the red osier dogwood in the back, which is also a wetland shrub. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. That's why we're here. Use us. We're a resource. We're supporting all of the work that you're doing. We just want to make sure that it happens in a way that is respectful of the wetland and its buffers, and that it's achieved in the time frame that you're looking to achieve it. So dam removals is another one that people might be involved with. But contact your district wetland ecologist. We're here on the side. Crystal, who's actually on this call today, she's our newest district ecologist. She's going to be taking over Grand Isle. She'll also be handling the majority of wetlands that violations that come into the program. Elijah specifically is working with the ARPA funded projects. So whether or not that ties in with any of yours, I'm not sure. He's statewide as well. Otherwise, look us up and contact each of us individually. Districts will be changing in 2023, going into this growing season, as well as 2024, as Crystal is fully trained and takes on those responsibilities. We're happy to do desktop reviews. We're happy to do site visits. We're happy to do pre-application reviews so that we can offer guidance as your projects come together. And we're overall a pretty fun bunch, and you don't have to be intimidated by us. We're here to help you out. The end.
That's just tremendous, Zap. You do such an amazing presentation with respect to all these resources, and just can't thank you enough. We still have 1 or 2 minutes left. If anyone has a burning question to ask.
And I can stay a little longer if people need or want to do that.
That's really just so helpful. And we did record this. We will make the recording available for folks. And you folks are a fun bunch. You really are great to work with and such a valuable resource. Can't thank you enough. And Zap, I'm also just so impressed with the work that you're doing on the side with your new organization. Did you want to just make a quick plug for that?
Yeah, I'll do better than that. So I've been working with Karina with the VNRC and a couple of consultants, and we've been forming a nonprofit organization, and it's specifically the Vermont Association for Wetland Science, and the word "for" was deliberate. It's to really capture a broad audience of folks that might be either just interested in wetlands, period, or are working in or around wetlands in some type of capacity. And so we just went live at the beginning of the month to do membership enrollment. We can do corporate memberships if you have a group of folks, which is great. And then more importantly, because we are so aggressive in our scheduling, remind me, Ethan, I need to learn how to say no sometimes. We are going to be doing our annual meeting, which is going for this year, just for the sake of planning purposes. It's only going to be open to VAWS membership, or those that are members of VAWS. But I'm gonna be doing a similar presentation, just a shortened version. But Stacy Pomeroy from Rivers is going to be presenting with Vermont Land Trust and Vermont River Conservancy. We have Kevin from Center for Eco Studies talking about vernal pools, David Wilcox, forestry, talking about logging in and around wetlands and new tools. We'll have both the State Wetland Program Manager and Army Corps talking about the new rule changes. And that's really important for Army Corps because they've lowered their threshold for in lieu fee from a 10,000 square foot fill threshold to 5,000 square foot. And then we're going to be wrapping up. But for any of you that would like to join, we'd love to have you. It's been a huge learning curve for me. I've never done IT before, so woohoo!
That's so great. Congratulations. That's really a huge undertaking and such a valuable resource.
Great. Well, if anybody has specific questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me individually. Otherwise, reach out and work with your district wetland ecologist. But spring is coming. The projects are going to be coming in, and we want this season to be successful. So in the meantime, enjoy winter again, and happy spring in a month's time.
At which time you'll become a much busier person.
Yes.
And then you'll be able to start using the word no a little bit more, perhaps.
Maybe. Take
Fair
care,
enough. Well,
everyone.
thank you all
Thanks so much.
for attending the presentation. Thank you so much for joining this workshop. Thanks, Zap. I'm going to stop the recording now, and then we will share that out.